Hello and welcome to The Last Word on Spurs. We hope you're keeping very, very safe and well. Thank you so much for joining us during this World Cup, break from Spurs. Isn't it nice? I feel like everyone's rejuvenated and they're just feeling back mentally again, which is great. You know, we're really enjoying Spurs being away for the moment. We can't wait for them to come back, of course, on Boxing Day. If you're listening to us for the first time, you can find us on iTunes, on Spotify, we're across all major audio platforms. We are, of course, on Twitter at Last Word on Spurs. We're across Facebook and Instagram too. And of course, we are also on YouTube where you can watch if you like to watch or listen if you like to listen. We're joined back alongside me for this one by Jason McGovern. Jace, nice having you back on Last Word on Spurs. You look so much more happier when it's not a game show to review. How are you?
Well, we don't have to talk longer than the actual game itself, so that's absolutely perfect for me, mate. Perfect.
Absolutely. No
I thought the World Cup had just finished. England had just won it.
No, we're in the midst of it.
I saw Ben Stokes win the World Cup for England, mate. Ben Stokes has done the job all over.
See, this is why you're taking this over at some point. We are going to press the red button and let you take the cricket version over when we've got a chance. We are trying to build that in for Jason if we possibly can. We're delighted to be bringing you a feature special on The Last Word on Spurs today. It's all about a book that is currently out in some of the shops out there, a really, really good Spurs book. And telling us more about this book as Jason holds it up there for our watching audience on YouTube. Tottenham's Three Lions. We've got the great author of the book joining us here, John Chambers. John, lovely to have you on Last One on Spurs. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Ricky. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to do the show.
Pleasure to have you here, John. It really, really is. And like I say, that book out right now, Tottenham's Three Lions for club and country, available to buy via Amazon and Legends Publishing for the moment. A really, really good, feel-good book about Spurs, about the international side of the game. And we laugh and joke on this show that obviously for me personally, my dedication has always been towards Tottenham, and I just take a break away when it's the international football, which is why it's great to get someone who is really passionate about international football and Jason on here. And John, I'm sure you'll say, I mean, how pleasing has it been to write the book before we get into the main crux of it?
Hi, Jason, by the way, as well, before we get going.
Yeah,
it's very pleasing. Yeah, it's a labour of love. Took me about 4 years to write it. But it's Spurs have had more England internationals than any other team. That was my inspiration behind it. I'm a big Spurs fan as well. More so Spurs fan than England fan. Started going to Spurs in 1977, so well over 40 years now. And just came to me one day that Spurs, when Eric Dyer played for England, we took over the record from Aston Villa, and we still hold it. There's been a few more that we've added and a few more that Villa have added, but we're still one ahead. And I thought it'd be a really good time to sort of do a book on it, really. And so there's a profile on every single player. It's a very big book, it's over 400 pages, and there is a picture on virtually every page, colour picture, apart from the black and white ones from when we do the guys from years and years ago. But it goes all the way back to 1903, right up to the current last England player we had, which was Harry Winks.
I know, Jace, you've had the pleasure actually having read of the book and seen of the book. What do you make of it, Jace?
Superb. It's a fantastic who's who of all our England players. As John says, some great pictures which will please Anthony Costa, because I know he doesn't like to read too much. So that should help him. Probably a few too many words for Ant, but he can only do about a 3 or 4 minute segment with his songs. But no, it's a fantastic book, and I think there's a great picture in there of Harry, Trippier, and Dyer and such all going. Danny Rose, I think it is, all going on to that sprinting towards Eric Dyer for that penalty shootout win last time round. So no, it's fantastic. Even you'll learn a lot. All the little one-cap wonders, your Anthony Gardners and people like that we don't assume as England internationals. But fantastic book, that's for sure.
Yeah,
perfect timing for Christmas, mate.
Absolutely, yeah, totally agree. And whilst that record's still there, John, we've got to get this out now before someone overtakes it, isn't it? That's the case at the moment. Spurs still breaking some records, maybe not the records that we all would like us to do, but definitely that book's still much in keeping with a really good record for Tottenham and England. Now, of course, it focuses on those players capped by England that were playing for Tottenham. Now, firstly, Jace, coming over to you. You've usually defended international football on the show. And you know, for me, I can't wait to get a break away from it, Jace. So why do you like international football so much, Jace?
It's not so much that I like international football. I just recognise that it has a place on the calendar, and I think John will confirm that when he interviewed some of the players for the book, they'll tell you just how much playing for England means. And when we talk about meaningless internationals, there's no such thing as a meaningless international. We take great pride in Harry Kane being, hopefully, within the next couple of days or so, England's highest ever goal scorer. But without some of those, what we call meaningless internationals, he wouldn't be along those figures. And I think whenever you play for your country, it's a huge deal. It really is. As fans, of course, our concentration is on Tottenham. And if you say to me now, do I want us to win, well, I was going to say the League Cup, but it won't be that. But if you want me to win next year's League Cup, or even just that North London derby in January over England winning a World Cup, I'd choose it. But international football has its role to play. And I think that the misconcept is, particularly with foreign players, just how important international football is to them over Tottenham. You know, Christian Romero, Heung-min Sons, Kulusevskis and that, they don't grow up as Spurs fans like you and me do. They grow up wanting to play for their country, and they're employed by Tottenham, but their country will always be the foremost pinnacle of the game for them.
You know, it's interesting, John, just bringing you in. First and foremost, you are obviously a Tottenham fan, as you've stated, and I'm interested to know from your perspective, John, is it for you club over country, or is it just as much as an England fan as Spurs from your perspective?
Well, both really. I would, if you gave me the choice of Spurs winning the league or England winning the World Cup, I'd have to go with Spurs. I'm sorry, but I'd like to see both happen, obviously. But it is Spurs for me, yeah. But I do follow England. I'm not one of these. I've been to a few England games, not so many away from home, but a few at home. Went to Euro '96, went to all the games there. That was fantastic. And I'm not one of these people that, you know, just turn up when the World Cup's on, basically. So sort of like next week, you'll get everybody will be in the pub, and a lot of them won't have even seen England play for nearly it's a year, because we had a tournament last year. But a lot of people don't even watch the qualifiers, and they turn up and they watch the World Cup and they claim they're big fans. You know, once this World Cup's over, I'm sure you're the same as me, Jason, and Ricky, you'll be sitting there watching the first England game in September when they're trying to qualify for the Euros in 2 years' time.
I mean, I won't, John, but Jason will be. I will be once again going on some form of break. Jason, just to bring you in on that conversation, Jace, club over country, where do you stand on it? I think I know where you stand, but
club will always be my priority. But like I say, I mean, we all know from World Cups and Euros and things, there's some truly iconic moments that we'll all remember. We'll all remember Eric Dyer taking that penalty in the shootout. And I do watch international football, even with a Spurs hat on. So I mean, one of the games I'm looking forward to is Uruguay-Korea, which is obviously Sonny against Bentancur. And I'll particularly watch France, and I'll watch Brazil's and that where our players are playing. And I think we all take great pride in that. And certainly that last World Cup, when I think Tottenham had more representations than anyone else, didn't we? That final weekend when we had Belgium, obviously with Toby Yan and Moussa Dembele's and things like that. It was a great pride for Tottenham to have. And when Hugo's the one that lifts the trophy, it's something the club should be proud of.
Yeah, just to divert the attention back to you, John, if we can. Obviously, look, you've told us that you're a Spurs fan. Tell us your connection to Spurs, John, and what's led you to making this great book.
Well, obviously, I started going to Spurs in 1977. Do you remember when we beat Bristol Rovers 9-0? Do you remember that game? So my dad was a Spurs fan when he was a kid growing up, and I started taking an interest in Spurs around 8 years old. And we won 9-0 against Bristol Rovers. That, even though it was in the second division, that game was on Match of the Day that night, and we both sat and watched it. And he said, "Oh, I'll take you over to Spurs Wednesday night." So my first game was the next game, which was Coventry. in the League Cup. We lost 3-2. But it was the first time I went to Spurs, and we sat up in the East Upper and we walked up the stairs. And a bit like a lot of people say, it's always good to go to your first game as a night game, because when you walk up the stairs and you see the pitch for the first time, how sort of bright it is, how green the grass is, I think it suckers you in forever, to be honest. Yeah. And even though we lost, we went to most of the games for the rest of that season, and then the next year got a season ticket, and been generally had a season ticket ever since.
You know what amazes me, Jason?
I was just going to say, what amazes me, John, is that's the only Saturday game that I missed all season that year. The one week, the worst possible week to be the naughty schoolboy, and my dad saying, "That's it, no Tottenham this weekend," and then you go and win 9-0. But the flip side was, I knew then it didn't matter how naughty I was, he was never going to miss taking me to another Tottenham game on the back of that. So I thought, right, I think we had Charlton, I think might have been the following week, or was it just before that? Might have been just before that. The Charlton game where we lost 4-1 was my first away game. But yeah, that Bristol Rovers one is, I must be the only fan that says he wasn't there when everyone else claims to have been there.
I know. Well, I was just about to say that I wasn't there as well, but I think every Spurs fan in the world claims they was there that day, and a lot of people claim it was their first ever game. But I think a lot of people are telling lies, really, to be honest. But I was there on the Wednesday night. That was my first ever game, and so I've always had an obsession with Spurs. And for the last 8 years, I've worked there as a tour guide as well. So that's pretty cool.
And what was the inspiration behind the book, John? Was it the fact of seeing some of those great games that has led you to want to inspire yourself and to write a book more about, predominantly the capping of the players? What's led you to making this book, John?
Right, so the decision came because I collect all the football programs and lots of Spurs books. I've read lots of Spurs literature, and so I've always had a passion for that sort of thing anyway. But when we used to work at the old stadium at White Hart Lane, I don't know if you remember, in the old West Stand box holders lounge, they had a big board of all the international players that had played whilst contracted to Spurs. So not just from England, from every single country. It covered the whole wall. And so we used to talk about that on the tours. And I researched quite a lot because we didn't say too much about that. It just used to mention that Ardiles was the first foreign player and point out the very first international, who was a guy called Jack Jones for Wales way back in 1896, whatever. But so I researched it and I found quite a lot of really good stories, especially with the guys that played in the 20s and things like that. The stories of when they went to war and interesting stories like that. And so I came back, told them on the tour, and so many people at the end of the tour used to say to me, those stories were really interesting, you should write a book about it. And I thought, well, I've never written a book, so I didn't think much of it at first, but so many people said it to me over the course of about 6 months that I decided, well, maybe I should do something. And then it just so happened that at the next particular time, Eric Dyer made his debut for England, and it was all in the press that Spurs had now overtaken the record of Aston Villa of the most England players. So I thought, why don't I do a book about Tottenham's England players? And it's never been done before, and and that was it. So it basically took me sort of 3 years to do it. It was a labour of love. So that's where the inspiration come from.
It's a real fascinating one, because I think even me and Jace the other day were sitting there working out who was the last capped England player, Jace. So I was saying I think we couldn't quite believe, was it Harry Winks the last player we said?
Harry Winks the last.
The last debutant, and we're thinking, God,
it's been a while,
long time, isn't it? Really, and despite the fact, we're holding
it's been a while. We had that glut of players, didn't we? Where we had sort of, when we went to Euro 2016, and we had 5 players actually in the team. And but since then, it's only really been, or Trippier came after that as well. But then Harry Winks. But it's been a few years now since we've had one. So I suppose the next ones might be. Jed Spencer, if he ever gets a game.
Nice.
And you got Sessignon and Skip. They're all of those 3 are in the under 21. So whether they can go on and progress to the full England squad is another matter, or otherwise it'll be a case of buying a player in.
I was going to say, when we bought Sessignon, the Fulham Sessignon, I would have sworn that he would have got his international cap by now. But then, having seen him play for Tottenham, I totally understand why he hasn't got one. But like I say, when we bought Sess, you would have expected him to have gone on over the next 3 or 4 years and got that international debut.
Yeah, I think there'll be a change. I think there'll be a change over the next. I don't know how long Gareth Southgate's contract is. Does anyone know? Is it just? Yeah,
it runs to the end of tournaments, doesn't it?
Yeah, it runs to the end of this tournament. Yeah.
So I mean, England are on quite a poor run at the moment, and if they don't do well in this World Cup, they may well look at having a new manager. And there's a lot of players coming to the end of their sort of time now. There's a lot of players approaching 30 or going over 30 that they may want to they might want to start bringing the younger players in. They've started to do that a little bit already. So over the next sort of couple of years, those guys that we mentioned there from Spurs, they might have a chance.
I mean, the book itself, John, it details all of our England representatives and how many in total we've had. What is the total number of caps, John? If you can give us that figure.
Yeah, so we've had 77 players in total. Some places claim we've had 78. I do reference this in the book because there was a guy called Frank Hartley in 1923 that played a game for England, and he played for Spurs actually 2 weeks before, but it was only like a trial match. He played the whole season for Oxford City. He was like it was just a trial. And the research that I've done, there's nowhere that references him as an actual Spurs player. If you go back and look at old newspapers from the time, he was always put down as Oxford City. But some media outlets claim he was a Spurs player, but Tottenham don't. In Bob Goodwin's book as well, Tottenham have never referenced him as a Spurs player either, and he's not on our board. But I did put him in the book just in case. So we've had 77, and the accumulation of caps over those 77 players is 1,034.
Wow.
So it's quite a lot of caps.
Yeah, and it's the highest number, of course, of any club, right? Spurs still proudly holding that record for the moment.
I've
I've
always claimed Maradona as a Spurs player, mate. So.
I actually think that Manchester United actually have more cumulative caps than us, but we have the most players. Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
But it's very close. It's not far. The spectrum's not far. We're only a few behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, it's always best to start at the very start, John. So who was that very first international and the pioneer for Tottenham? Right.
So Spurs only joined the Southern League in 1896, even though they was formed in 1882. So for the first sort of 18 years or whatever, they was playing friendlies just on the park and whatever. They built a small ground. But so until we joined the Southern League, we wasn't even considered really as having an England player. So we had a few players that had trials. The first one was a guy called Harry Bradshaw, who came down from Liverpool. He was actually capped for England while he played for Liverpool, and he had a trial in 1899, but he wasn't successful. Then we had a couple more trials as well. Tom Morris, who was in our FA Cup winning side in 1900, had a trial, but he was unsuccessful as well. But the actual first one was Vivian Woodward in 1903, and so he was. So you've got like legacy numbers now. England have got legacy numbers where the historian, I think Brian Beard, his name was, when England played their 1,000th game, he gave every England player a number, starting from the very first 11, and then every time someone got a cap afterwards. So Vivian Wood was 283. So there was quite a lot of players selected before a Spurs player was actually selected. Vivian came along. He was an amateur, sort of like an upper class gentleman. Like step up for lift kind of guy. He could play for anyone because he remained an amateur. He sometimes he used to like finishing off the cricket season. You'd be interested in that, Jason. So he was never really available for Spurs for the first few games of the season while he was finishing off the cricket season with the Essex second 11. And then he would always go and play for, if Clacton or Chelmsford got to important games, he would go off and play for them as well. But so he only really ever played in half of Spurs' fixtures. But he played for England in 1903, made his debut, scored a couple of goals in a 4-0 win against Ireland, and went on to score 29 goals in just 23 matches for England, which was the record goal scorer. So he was the record goal scorer for 45 years, believe it or not. So he still holds the record for the most consecutive time of holding that record, if you know what I mean. Bobby Charlton was within about 3 weeks of breaking his record because Bobby Charlton actually had a lot of people forget that in the middle of Bobby Charlton held the England goal scoring record for a while early on in his career, but then Jimmy Greaves overtook him for a while, and then Bobby Charlton overtook Jimmy because he played on for a lot longer. So consecutively from when he took it over from Jimmy, he was literally, Wayne Rooney took it off him about 3 weeks before he was about to break Vivian Woodward's record. So it still stands, that record, which is pretty cool.
That's pretty good for Tottenham to have Woodward, Greaves, Gary Lineker, and like I say, in the next few weeks, hopefully Harry goes on and breaks it. To have all those top goal scorers, Yeah,
we've also, with goal scoring, I mean, we've had 17 hat-tricks have come from Tottenham players. Over the years, and that's I think the next team on that list is Manchester United, and they've only got 9. So it shows you how, you know, with goal scorers we're pretty much right up there, and a lot of those guys at the top are because they played a lot of games. Rooney played 120 games, I think. Bobby Charlton played 109 games, whereas Jimmy only played 57 matches to get his 44 goals. Yeah, and Kane is about to break Rooney's record, and he's played like 50 games less. Yeah, so it's unbelievable.
Crazy.
Going back to Vivian Woodward, he was like everyone on the pitch used to call him Sir because he was an architect by trade as well, and even the referees and the opposition used to call him Sir. And there was a particular time where the ball hit the underside of the bar, you know, a bit like Jeff Hurst in the World Cup final, and they wasn't sure if it had gone over the line. So the referee went up to Vivian and said, Mr. Woodward, did the ball cross the line? And Vivian said, yes, it did. So the referee turned around and said, well, if Mr. Woodward thinks it's a goal, it's a goal. I mean, can you imagine that these days? Can you imagine saying that to Jose Mourinho?
Yeah, oh God, could you imagine? Oh dear.
Now, another famous name in Spurs history is, of course, Jinking Jimmy Dimmock, one of our goal scorers from 21. He was in the England side in those days, and I believe he was part of a record-breaking England side.
That's right, yeah. So he played. He made his debut against Scotland in 1921. It's a game that England unfortunately lost 3-0 up at Hampden Park. But he was one of 4 Spurs players on the day that played, and so that set a record for Spurs, where that was the most players we had in the England team, and that record stayed intact until 1987. Yeah, until when we played Turkey, when we had 5 players. But so we had 4 players that day. So Jimmy was he was a left winger. He holds a unique record in Spurs' history as well. He is the only player to play 400 league games and score 100 league goals.
Wow.
So others have played the games or scored the goals, but they've never done both together. Yeah. So he's remarkable. The only person. Yeah. So I think Harry Kane's on the way. He's on the way, but he needs to play nearly another 100 games yet in the league before he actually beats that record. So if he hangs around, he might do it. But no one else has actually done that. So he was at Spurs for well over 10 years. Came from Edmonton, just down the road. There's a cup named after him as well, Edmonton Schools Trophy. So he's and apparently I've spoken to some older guys that did the tour once, and they sort of knew him. You could always find him later on in his life. You could always find him in the local pub in Edmonton, and people just used to buy him drinks all night. As long as you bought him a drink, he'd tell you all the stories about Spurs, and so that was pretty cool. And that goal he scored in the cup final, he scored the winning goal in the 1921 FA Cup final, and that was his first ever goal in the FA Cup. He couldn't have picked a better time, could he?
So I feel I'm getting a lesson here. I feel like I'm getting a real lesson from John in the history of Tottenham. I feel proper unqualified to do this. I must admit, I really, really am. Moving on a decade, Jace, coming over to you. A name that I know, Jace, you have a huge regard for, and I probably should just hand over to you to take it away now, Jace.
Yeah, I mean, Arthur Rowe was capped for England. Arthur Rowe, for lots of supporters that have grown up thinking Bill Nick is the number one figure at Tottenham, and in many ways Bill is, and I have never ever had any problem with the adulation Bill Nick receives, but I think there's a lack of adulation or respect in most people's mind for everything that Arthur Rowe did for the football club. It was Arthur Rowe that brought us up from the 2nd division, and to come up as 2nd division champions and then to win the 1st division the following season. That's an amazing feat. It was Arthur Rowe. Bill obviously takes a lot of credit for the style of football, but the famous push and run was actually developed by Arthur Rowe, and it was Arthur Rowe himself that brought Bill to the club as a player. So I've always said Bill might well have built the house of Tottenham Hotspur, but Arthur Rowe's role in laying the foundations is huge. And like I say, there's lots of people out there will know all the stories of Bill, but Arthur Rowe deserves so much credit for our amazing football club. Yeah,
that's to embellish on that, Jason. So Arthur Rowe and Bill Nicholson are both in the book because they both played for England. And in Bill Nicholson's profile, I did mention that. So Bill's sort of mantra was keep it quick, keep it simple, like the push and run, But sort of that was ingrained in his DNA by Arthur Rowe, really. That's where it all come from, yeah. So Arthur was... Like Jason mentioned, he played one game for England against France, actually at White Hart Lane. It was a 4-1 win back in 1933. And so he was a centre half, Arthur Rowe, and I think he played 201 games for Spurs and never scored a goal. And his excuse for that was that back in those days, you was rarely allowed past the halfway line if you was the centre half. So centre halves never came up for corners or anything. They just stood at the back, and that's what they did. And you were sort of never really allowed to leave the club as well. I don't think Arthur would have wanted to leave the club because he was born just round the corner in Tottenham. He attended the 1921 FA Cup final as a young lad. So, you know, he could... I doubt if he could actually ever imagine that just probably about 10 years later, he would be on the same pitch as Jimmy Dimmock, you know, so who scored the winning goal in that cup final. But yeah, so Arthur, he played the one game, only played the one game, unfortunately. He was replaced by Ernie Hart of Leeds in the next game. But went on to be, like, you know, as Jason said, at the time, our most successful manager, but it had a lot to do with what Bill Nicholson went on to achieve as well. So he went away after Spurs. He went away, he came back. He went to Hungary actually, and learnt a lot in Hungary. So the Hungarians were already sort of, you know, in England we played that stiff sort of WM formation that Herbert Chapman sort of invented in the 1920s. Quick thing on Herbert Chapman, guys. You've probably heard of him. There's a statue of him outside that horrible stadium just down the road, 2 miles away from us. Yeah, because he was their manager. But what all their fans do not know, he played for Spurs for
2 miles away.
Oh, sorry,
I thought Woolwich was a bit further than 2 miles away, mate.
It should be.
I thought you had to get a Woolwich ferry over to that part of London.
It should be. But what all of their fans don't know is that Herbert Chapman played for Spurs for 3 years. So they have a statue of a Spurs player outside their stadium, which I think is pretty cool, yeah? And also, you talking about the Woolwich, Arthur Rowe, I've seen some interviews of him in sort of like later on in the 70s and that, and he was still referring to Arsenal as the Woolwich. That's how bit of that sort of thing was back then. Yeah, he still used to refer to them as the Woolwich. But he went off to Hungary for a few years. He did some coaching over there, and I think he picked a lot of his ideas up from there, because you remember that great Hungarian team that pulled England to pieces in the 1950s. So they were all, that's it, they were already playing a sort of fluid system where they all moved around, whereas in England it was the centre half marked the centre forward, and, you know, your full-backs marked the inside forwards, and they just followed them all around the pitch. Whereas the Hungarians were already doing sort of like more like modern day football, where your centre forward would drop and the inside forwards would swap over, and it just totally confused like teams in England. The centre half wouldn't know where to go, and Arthur sort of brought that into Chelmsford first, where he won quite a few cups at Chelmsford before he became our manager, and then introduced it to us. So it's like a fluid type of play, like keep it simple, quick pass, move, everybody move around. Yeah. So, and like you say, he doesn't get the credit he deserves, to be honest. No.
So then we get on to the latter years, and of course the Second World War intervenes. But upon resumption, one of our huge legends of the club, 452 appearances and a league title winner. I believe we had our first England capped goalkeeper.
That's right, yeah. So we had a few chances before Ted Ditchburn. Back in 1903, there was a trial match at White Hart Lane. It was actually the trial match that secured Vivian Woodward's first cap. But George Clawley, who was the goalkeeper in the 1901 FA Cup final, he played in that England trial match as well. But on that particular time, he wasn't successful. Although there are some people that say that he was only ever playing just to boost the attendance because it was at White Hart Lane. So I'm not so sure. Yeah, that might have been the case, but he was unsuccessful. And there were a couple of guys in the 1930s, a guy called John Nicholson, who was if you ever see any team photos from the 1930s, there's one guy who's about a foot taller than everybody else. And that was the goalkeeper, John Nicholson. And then we had another keeper, Cyril Spires, but they was unsuccessful as well. So the first one was Ted Ditchburn in 1948. He played a couple of wartime internationals first, but then made his debut against Switzerland at Highbury, actually, down the road. And so it was 66 years after Spurs formed that they actually had a goalkeeper that played for England. But Ted should have played more for England, really. He only played 6 times. And because they had Frank Swift. I don't know if you remember Frank Swift. He was one. Yeah, one of England's legendary goalkeepers of all time. So he played before the war and played virtually all the wartime games as well. But after the war, he was coming towards the end of his career. He played the first couple of years after the war. He retired in 1949. They went on tour. They went on a European tour at the end of the season. They took 3 keepers, Swift, Ted Ditchburn and Bert Williams, who was the goalkeeper of the Great Wolves team of the early 50s that won the championship and whatever a few times. And so Ted played in the first game on that tour in Sweden, and he was supposed to be Swift's sort of successor. But unfortunately, we lost 3-1 in Sweden. Ted was blamed for a couple of the goals, although he complained that the sun in the sky had blinded him. So he's saying it wasn't his fault, yeah, like a good goalkeeper would. So he was dropped for the next game. Swift came in for his last ever match, and then Williams played in the last game, I think, against France. And then he kept his place, Williams. And so it's unfortunate, really. So while Spurs were winning the league in 1951, Ted wasn't really getting a game for England, which was a shame. They was picking Bert Williams instead. And then Bert Williams got injured, and you thought Ted would come in, but they plucked Gil Merrick from Birmingham City, who were in the 2nd division at the time, which that was a surprise. I think never seen him play. Apparently, he was a good goalkeeper, but I think Ted was a little bit unlucky, to be honest, to not win as many caps.
Just on that, Rick, I was going to say, in those days, look, you let in 3, you were dropped from the England setup. Now, like Aaron Ramsdale, you can let in 4 and still go to a World Cup. And that's the first, isn't he the first goalkeeper to let in 4 since was it 2010, Aaron Ramsdale?
That's crazy, isn't it, when you think about it? It is crazy. I mean, even Pickford, again, has had, some really bad weeks in the build-up to the World Cup. What we are going to do is we are going to go for our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. For those that are watching here, we're delighted to be joined by, alongside me, Jason McGovern, and the author of the book that's coming out now, Tottenham's 3 Lions for Club and Country. We're joined by John Chambers. That book available via Amazon and from Legends Publishing. I'm really enjoying, I'm getting a lesson here, I think, in all things Tottenham and even England. So thank you so much, John, for your time. I know Jason's enjoying mocking me throughout this one, as he always does when I'm completely out of my depth, which is probably every week on Last Word on Spurs. John, we have to ask about perhaps the most famous name on the list, and that's of Sir Alf Ramsey, now winning 31 of his 32 caps whilst at Spurs. Tell us a little bit about him in general and that amount of caps he did accumulate.
Yeah, so Alf, he won his first cap at Southampton. So Alf grew up in Dagenham, and he actually, when he first left school, he used to ride a bike for the co-op, delivering groceries. That's how things have changed for footballers these days. And he was promised a trial for Portsmouth, but nothing ever came of it. So he didn't think, that was the end of his football career, basically. But then the war started, so he went off to war, and he played football for the army. And he played a game for the army against Southampton's reserves, and he sort of was a star in that game. And so Southampton offered him a place. So he ended up at Southampton. Played for them for a couple of years, and then we managed to sign him. In fact, Southampton made the decision to drop him and put in another guy who had just made his England debut as well, a guy called Billy Ellington, I think his name was. And so they decided that Alf was a bit too old, and they put in this younger guy because he'd taken Alf's place in the England team. Then Alf came to Spurs. And then there was an injury, and he got back in and ended up playing sort of nearly those 31 games he played for Spurs were near enough consecutive. I think he only missed maybe 1 or 2 games through a couple of year period. So he was a great player. Little bit older by the time he joined Spurs. I think he was about 29, 30 when he came to Spurs. But like a lot of those guys that in the push and run side, they all carried on till they was about 35, 36 because they'd missed 7 years of their career. So they all felt cheated, so they all carried on for as long as possible. And a little known fact about Alf Ramsey, it came out that when he went to the Palace to be knighted for winning the World Cup, it was actually ascertained that he was 2 years older than he actually said. Because a lot of players did this when they came back from the war, because birth certificates, no one really had a birth certificate, whatever, back in those days, and they all sort of claimed they was a couple of years younger, so it would prolong their football career. And that was only found out when he was when he went to be knighted, to find out his actual real age. But yeah, he was a great player. Like Jason said, Arthur Rowe introduced a system where back in those days it was generally the keeper booted the ball down the field to the forward, and then you all try and get your head on it. But we started playing like Ditchburn would throw the ball out to the fullbacks, generally to Alf because he was the better fullback, and Alf would then interchange passes with the midfield, Bill Nicholson and whatever. And that's how we started. That's how the pass and move came about. So he wasn't the quickest of players, but a very skillful player, good on the ball. I think he scored a goal at Grimsby once, and the Enfield Gazette said it was one of the greatest goals ever scored by a Spurs player. I think he ran from the halfway line, took a few players on, and then fired it up in the top corner. And so he was a penalty expert as well. Could take penalties with both feet apparently, which was a ruse to sort of put off the goalkeeper. So he was known as the penalty king. And also he had another nickname, the General, because he was sort of, very vocal on the field and sorted out with him and Bill Nicholson on the pitch. They sort of sorted all the tactics out for that team, and both went on to be fine managers.
And then I think that part of that 1951 side, of course, is Bill, and I think he only got one England cap, didn't he, Bill? Yeah,
just the one cap. Bill was actually one of the best right halves in the country, but unfortunately for Bill, Billy Wright was a right half as well.
And just for the younger viewers, what's a right half close to being? Ricky's thinking the right half is the right half of the TV I watch. He thinks the right half is only in the second
right
half,
as well.
and
He's bloody right as well.
Yeah, so it's basically sort of midfield, isn't it? Right midfield. And sort of you got your right and left half. Used to have a centre half in between them. The fullbacks were behind, but it was generally more like a midfield role. That's what he played. But unfortunately, Billy Wright was England's captain. Played over 100 games, 90 of them as captain. So back in those days, no substitutes, no squads, and they took a squad to a World Cup. But any other game, there was no squad. So you had a couple of reserves, and I think Bill was a reserve on about 19 separate occasions. So he was a very highly regarded player, but just unfortunate to play in the same era as Billy Wright. So the game, he made his debut in 51 against Portugal in a Festival of Britain match. We won 5-2, and Bill scored after 19 seconds. And to this very day, that still remains England's fastest goal by a debutant. There's been a fastest goal in the game by a player, but he's the fastest ever debutant. So I remember Harry Kane scored after 79 seconds on his debut. So that was a bit slow compared to Bill. So he said as soon as he hit it, he knew it was going in. And I think Portugal equalised a minute later as well. But they won the game 5-2. And he would have won another cap, to be honest, as well. He was selected for another game in 1951 as well against Austria. Austria were one of the best teams in the world at the time, and they had a playmaker called Ernst Ockwick, who was one of the best players in the world. So the plan was to move Billy Wright to the left to mark him, and Bill was going to come in at right half. But unfortunately, he got injured on the game before for Spurs, and he had to withdraw from the squad. So it would have been 2 caps, but he just goes down as the one. But as I said, a reserve for quite a lot of time as well. So, but for Billy Wright, would have played a lot more games. The same thing happened to Maurice Norman as well, unfortunately, because Billy Wright moved to centre half in 1950 during the 1958 World Cup. England had a problem with centre halves. And so Billy Wright played there, and he carried on playing for a couple more years. And so Maurice Norman couldn't get in the England team as well because Billy Wright was playing centre half. So he had to wait until he retired, basically. So
it's interesting. I mean, you said Bill was a 1 cap wonder. John, I mean, how many on the list have actually earned just the 1 cap out of interest? Do you have the actual figure there?
Yeah, I did write it down yesterday, actually. I think it was 22. 22. Okay. Yeah, 22 1 caps, yeah. And so quite a lot of those have come through Spurs Academy as well. Depends on what you define as academy. Obviously, for the last 20 years or so, you've had an academy. But so Bill Nicholson, you would claim as being an academy player as well, I suppose. A little bit different in those days when they sort of came straight from school, and they was actually part of the ground staff for a couple of years before they signed professional contracts. So they would go around doing all the sort of painting. We always said they used to get him painting the girders in the stands and things like that, and cleaning all the boots.
Yeah,
I don't think
Can you imagine that today? Can you imagine that today? It's just
I think they're on about £1,000 a week now, aren't they?
Yeah.
15, 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
Well, not all of them, but too much money. But we've had some quite notable players that have only played just the once, to be honest. So Bill Nicholson, one of the most famous ones. Ron Henry, who was part of the double side. He only ever got one cap for England, surprisingly. They used to pick a guy that was playing for Middlesbrough instead for some reason, while Spurs were winning everything. This guy from Middlesbrough there's a picture of him in the book. He looks exactly like Vinnie Jones, this guy.
Okay.
It's in the Jimmy, if you're looking there, Jason, it's in the Jimmy Greaves section where there's a picture of Jimmy Greaves shaking hands with Prince Philip. And next to him is this guy that looks exactly like Vinnie Jones. And he was Mick McNeil. And he kept Ron Henry out the England side. So he managed to only play one game. And unfortunately, England got thrashed 5-2. And he got a bit of a run around. So he never played again, unfortunately. Some other notable one-cap players. So Stephen Corker. Do you remember Stephen Corker? He played one cap.
Yeah,
he played against Sweden.
He scored, didn't he? I think.
He scored. He scored. And it was the game when Zlatan scored 4 goals, including that overhead kick from about 30 yards. Do you remember that? Yeah.
That's probably why they got sore again after that.
Yeah. No. Corker actually, it was 1-1 when Stephen came off.
Right. Okay. So, he can't be.
On 75 minutes, and then they brought on Ryan Shawcross, and Zlatan scored a hat trick in 15 minutes, and Ryan Shawcross never played again for England.
Sounds about right, doesn't it? Sounds about right.
Yeah.
John, the 60s saw Spurs dominate that England forward line with 2 great strikers, Bobby Smith and, of course, the legendary Jimmy Greaves. I don't know if you got the figure there again. You'll tell us the caps between them and the goals total between them and individually.
Yeah, well, Bobby Smith scored 13 goals in 15 matches for England, which was a pretty good record, to be honest. And between them, this is even more amazing. Between them, they scored the partnership of Greaves and Smith 31 goals in just 13 games.
That is ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, I say the way we romanticise about Kane and Son's record together. I mean, that in itself is just remarkable, isn't it? I mean, Jace, I know you're going to come in here as well. Mental, isn't it, Jace? That's crazy.
Jimmy Greaves is obviously one of the names on the list that sadly I didn't see. That I just, I wish there's Dave Mackay. I wish I would have seen. There's Danny Blanchard. I wish I'd have seen. There's Cliff Jones. Many from that double side. John White is another one, but Jimmy Greaves, my dad's side, always still to this day, every single striker he sees, he compares to Jimmy Greaves. And I think if you are from that era, I don't think, be it Kane, be it Shearer, be it Lewandowski or anyone has ever been a better striker than. I know football's changed, but there hasn't been a better goal scorer in football than Jimmy Greaves. That's what they all tell me.
More than Ronaldo? Even Ronaldo, Jace?
You can't compare. You can't compare the games there and now. But I mean, when you look at Jimmy Greaves' record, both at Tottenham, both at England and Tottenham, I mean, it's ridiculous. And here we are. Again, hopefully Harry breaks England's record in the next few days, but hopefully in the next month or so, ideally in that Arsenal game, he'll go past Jimmy's record. But the fact that Jimmy's record is still standing at Tottenham, and you're not talking about somebody who spent 25 years at Tottenham. That's the thing. His stats are absolutely ridiculous, mate. Ridiculous.
Yeah, he was 9. Jimmy Greaves is. I used to say this on the tour. He's got to be the best striker in England ever, to be honest. So Harry is just about to break his record. He will break it this season, but that is only his Tottenham record. So if you take into consideration he's top of the all-time Division 1 goal list, Jimmy Greaves still, and that's 357. That's just league goal. Okay, so Harry Kane's got 108. He's 109. He's just coming up to 200 league goals. So he would have to score another. He'd nearly have to double that again to beat Greaves' actual, which he probably won't do, to be honest. So to give you, so he's top of that list. There's a couple of guys, Dixie Dean, you've probably heard of him, and a guy called Steve Bloomer. They're the only other 2 people that have scored over 300 top flight goals. But Jimmy's over 40 goals ahead of both of them. And the most modern day player on that list is Alan Shearer. He's 5th. And if you include the 23 goals he scored in the in the first division before he went to the Premier League as well. He's got 287 or something like that as well. So that shows you how high Jimmy is. I mean, he'd scored before he left Chelsea. He'd scored like 135 league goals in just 4 seasons. He was the fastest player to get to 100 league goals. He'd scored 100 league goals by the time he was 20 years old. I think the actual stat is 20 years old and 291 days or something. But to do that before you're 21, to score 100 league goals, he scored for against Spurs on his debut at White Hart Lane, and he scored on every debut for every team and England as well. But he's just a phenomenon. He's got 66 times he's won the Golden Boot in England, so that's a record as well. I think. Harry Kane, he's got 3, so he's on top of that. 6, he's done it 6, and it would have been 7 had he not spent 6 months in Italy. So he spent the first 6 months of the 62 season in Italy, came back to Spurs in late December, and still scored 30 league goals by the end of the season. Yeah, but unfortunately, some other guy had been there the whole season and scored a couple more, or whatever. So he didn't get. So if he'd have been there the whole season, he probably would have scored 40 or 50.
And it's crazy to think that. I mean, everyone this year has been blown away by Haaland, and the stats that Haaland is setting is crazy. And yet, they're no greater than Jimmy's stats. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So if for those young people, think of the goals and what Haaland's doing. And then think Jimmy Greaves was doing this for Tottenham as well.
Yeah, I saw a tweet the other week from Jimmy's son, Danny Greaves. Yeah. And when that record was going on about Haaland scoring all those goals in these games, he brought out the record that in the same number of games at the start of Jimmy's career, he had more goals than Haaland.
Oh, what's his famous quote about a drought? It's a brilliant quote, isn't it? Isn't it something like, I once had a drought and didn't score for 15 minutes or something like that?
15 minutes, yeah. Well, I saw him. I only saw it. I was a bit like you, Jason. I never saw him play for a proper game for Spurs, but I saw him playing a couple of testimonials in the late 70s for Pat Jennings and John Pratt, and I think he still scored in both games. He was about 44 then. And going back to you mentioned Cliff Jones earlier as well. I mean, Cliff's still about the club. He's late 80s now. He still turns up every match day. Yeah, walks around and does the corporate stuff. But he was my teacher at school, Cliff Jones.
Right.
Yeah, so I went to Highbury Grove School, unfortunately, on the wrong side of town. But he was my PE teacher, and so he must have been about 45, 50 maybe when we was at school, and he was still faster than us 15-year-olds even at that age. Yeah. So how fast he would have been when he was playing, I do not know.
He's still quick now. He still dashes around and things like that. It's amazing.
Crazy.
You see videos of him in his garden, doing his exercise. This bloke's in his 80s. Fantastic.
Yeah,
fantastic. Then a man who was first captain in 1964, I believe, set an unwanted landmark in England history.
Yeah, Alan Mullery you're talking about there. So Alan Mullery was, so he came from Fulham. Didn't even really want to leave Fulham. Fulham were his heroes, and because I spoke to Alan was kind enough to do an interview in the book for me there. There's a few Gary Mabbott, Graham Roberts and Mickey Hazard done an interview as well. And before anyone says, hold on, Mickey Hazard never played for England, you are correct, but he did make a squad a couple of times. And there is a section in the book where I've featured uncapped players as well. So players that either were reserves or made the squad as well. So Mickey was part of that. Yeah, so Alan came from Fulham. Bill Nicholson went over to Fulham, agreed the deal. And so they called Alan into the office, and Alan said, I don't want to leave. He was quite happy. His hero was Johnny Haynes. He was in the team with him, and he didn't want to leave. So anyway, they forced him into leaving. They said, you're going, that's it. And but Bill said, can you keep him this week to play against Liverpool? Because they was challenging Tottenham at the top of the league. So he had to go home and tell his wife, I'm moving to Spurs, but I've got to play for Fulham this week. They want me to play. So anyway, so he did that. And it was because Fulham wanted to build a new stand, so they needed the money. And Alan always jokes they never named that stand after me either. So, but he played against Liverpool. They won. He done us a favour. But after the game, he told the manager, I'm leaving. The manager had no idea that he was leaving. and his name was Bedford Jezzard. What a great name, eh?
Wow.
He played for England as well, and he resigned. He resigned on the spot because they'd sold Alan without him knowing. So then but towards the end of the '64 season, he actually got picked for England to go on a tour while he was still a Fulham player. This is quite an interesting story. So the letter came through the door. He thought, like they all say, I thought it was a joke, but anyway, he realised it was true. So he thought, great. So, and then he was day before he was due to meet up with the team, he was having a shave in his bathroom, and the next minute his back went out and he was on the floor in agony and he couldn't move. And they had to call the club doctor to his house, and they managed to get him downstairs and get him to hospital. And he just literally was in hospital for 3 days so he couldn't go off on that tour. So he didn't make his debut then. So he injured himself shaving. Can you imagine that?
Oh, that's crazy.
Rick wouldn't have a clue what that is. So that's what it is. He's scared of putting his back out. That's why he don't have a shave.
Well, razors are expensive these days, aren't they?
They bloody are. They bloody are expensive.
So he made his debut for Spurs a few months later. Once he joined Spurs, he played in Holland in '64, and then sort of went off the England radar for a little bit because he was always in a battle with Nobby Stiles. He played in the same position as Nobby Stiles. So at schoolboy level, Nobby Stiles got the nod from Manchester boys, so he played for England instead of Alan. And also sort of youth level as well. Alan won no caps because they picked Stiles as well. And so there was always this running battle between Stiles and Mullery. And then, of course, Stiles got in the England team and was part of the World Cup winning side. But in 1967, Stiles got injured and Alan came in just after the FA Cup final, which he starred in, which Spurs won. And then he managed to stay in the team and right through to sort of like 1972, really. But the incident he's most famous for is in '68 when they went to the Euros in 1968, England. First time they'd been in a European Championship. And back in those days, there was only 4 teams in the final tournament, which was a bit strange. So you're straight into a semi-final. And we played Yugoslavia. It was an ill-tempered game. They kicked us all over the place. And just a minute before the end, they kicked Alan and they cut all the back of his Achilles. He had a great big scrape down his leg. So Alan being Alan, he just turned around and chinned the fella. And and so that was it. He was off, and he became the first ever player to be sent off for England, unfortunately. So he doesn't like it. He hates the fact that he was the first England player sent off. He's really sort of like he says he's ashamed of it, and it's a record that he doesn't want. So he trudged off anyway. So he went into the dressing room, and then Alf came in, and the rest of the team came in a few minutes later. They lost the game 1-0, so they're out. And so he's in the bath, and he's thinking, "Oh no, Alf's going to kill me." So Alf sort of walked over towards the bath. So he went under the water to try and hide. And then, and then a hand came in the water, and that was Alf Ramsey, and grabbed him by the hair and picked him up and brought him out the water. And he said, "I want a word with you." So he had to get out of the bath, and he's having a word with him. And to his amazement, instead of telling him off, he said, "I'm going to pay your fine from the FA." He said, "I'm glad someone hit them back because they were horrible." So.
Isn't it mad that you look at the way the football has changed these days now? I mean, with agents and what you'd have involved, it's just the world of football has just changed dramatically to where it is at. John, after the likes of the two Martins, Peters and Chivers came, for whom many is our most gifted player, Glenn Hoddle. And to show your age, Chase, I think you remember his England debut, don't you, Chase?
I think that's the first Tottenham player I ever remember getting his debut. I can remember it having huge amount of pride that finally I was going to see a Spurs player play for England, because the Peters and the Chivers and such was a fraction, really. Their England careers was before I started to notice it. And then because Tottenham had that mid-70s low of relegation battles and them being down in the second division for that year, we weren't producing England players. But Glenn, I forget how old Glenn would have been, but it's certainly the first one, and against Bulgaria, and scoring on his debut, a brilliant goal, top corner goal. He's just, for me, still is the best Tottenham player I've seen, other than Maradona, who, like I say, I'm claiming Diego as one of our own. But Glenn's abilities, anyone, you speak to crackers, you speak to anyone my age, everyone will still say it's the best player we've ever seen in a Tottenham shirt. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. My favourite all-time Spurs player of history, because as I said, 77 I started going, so Glenn was obviously in the team then. A star of the second division, getting us up and everything, and then sort of when Ardiles and Villa came, that midfield was something else, and a tragedy really that he only played 53 times for England. Should have had over 100 caps. And they picked like Wilkins and Robson, good players, but did the same job really. Glenn Hoddle was so much more talented than all of those guys. So Platini once said, we played against France in 1984. I think they lost the game, but Glenn had a good game. And Platini came afterwards and said, if Hoddle was French, we would build the whole team around him, and he would have over 100 caps by now. And also, do you remember when Glenn destroyed Feyenoord in 1984 en route to winning the Europa Cup, and Cruyff was on the opposition? It was an ageing Cruyff, but Cruyff decided that they singled out Hoddle as the danger man. So Cruyff decided to mark him in the first half, and he gave Cruyff a complete run around, and we were 4-0 up at half time. So Cruyff decided not to mark him in the second half, and they pulled a couple of goals back. But after the game, again, he came into the dressing room, gave Glenn his shirt and said, you're the best player I've played against, you deserve this. So that's how highly regarded Glenn was. I think that game you're talking about, the Bulgaria game, I think he was only about 20 years old, to be honest. He was quite young. I went to that game because as Jason mentioned,
just on that, I mean, people won't realise in those days playing for England, you didn't get Jude Bellinghams and things coming into the team nowhere near the squads at 17, 18. I mean, you had to play. You'd have played a good couple of seasons at least of senior first division football before you'd have got anywhere near becoming an England player.
No, that's right. Yeah, so it was an achievement. But I went to that game because, as you said, you had Chivers, Coates, Mullery, Peters, early 70s. They played for England. But then the demise of the club, and we had, for a good few years, we never had an England international. So Glenn sort of broke that duck. And so my dad said, come, we go watch the game. So it was actually, we went there and it was called off. I don't know if you remember. It was the first ever England game at Wembley to be called off because of fog. So we actually got all the way to the stadium and it was called off. So we had to go back the next night. And
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and then we won 2-0. And Glenn set a goal up for Dave Watson. Do you remember Big Dave Watson, the big centre half?
Yeah,
he crossed one. That, yeah. That's it. Yeah, crossed. No, not that. The Dave Watson before him. There was 2 Dave Watsons, weren't there? Do you remember? The big centre half. Yeah, and so he crossed the ball in for him. He scored, and then he scored that wonder goal as well, side foot right up into the top corner from 20 yards, and then same old England. They didn't pick him much after that for 2 or 3 years. It was bizarre. 82 World Cup, they played Graham Rix instead of him, And no disrespect to Graham Rix, but he was nowhere in Glenn Hoddle's class. But Glenn was always sort of destined for England. They won the Mini World Cup. Don't know if you know this. When they was about 18 years old, there was a youth tournament called it's basically like the European Championships now, but they used to call it the Mini World Cup. And they went over to Switzerland and they won the tournament. And they had a midfield of Hoddle, Robson, Wilkins, and Peter Barnes. Not a bad midfield, is it? Yeah. So that was regarded as one of the greatest England youth teams of all time. So they won that tournament. I think Ray Wilkins scored the winning goal in the final. Then he played through the through the under 21s, and but he should have won more caps. I mean, it wasn't until sort of the 86 World Cup really when Robson gave him sort of more of moved him actually into the centre. When Robson, do you remember Robson got injured and Wilkins got sent off?
That's right. Robson did his shouldering, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, even at the start of that World Cup, he was out on the right. They were playing him out on the right. And it was only that them two sort of the misfortune, them two were out the side. He managed to move inside. And from that moment on, England won the next 2 games 3-0. And they was looking like, and they was unlucky against Argentina in that World Cup, really. I mean, Glenn nearly scored a couple of goals in that game. Nearly scored a keeper, done a worldie save from one of his free kicks, and obviously the handball. But he should have won more caps. Should have won 100 caps, in my opinion.
Honestly, when I watch him back now, what I get shown the videos is just wonderful, wonderful player. And even with YouTube now, I think it's very hard to even comprehend, just how good a player he was unless you were watching him, Jason. I'm sure you agree, back in at the time when he was playing, right? It's impossible to try and visualise or even understand just how big a player he was and what he done.
I mean, balls were a lot heavier than they are now. Pitches were nowhere near the same now. I mean, a lot of people will say Glenn was a bit soft. I never thought he was soft, because you're talking about a person that would be kicked from pillar to post every game but would still come back. So you don't have to be a dirty player to be a hard player. But the punishment that Glenn would, I mean, you played Liverpool, Graham Souness would be all around him, constantly kicking lumps out of him. Yeah. So but it's hard now. I mean, because of the way modern football is and positions, it would be hard to know. But Glenn would be in every team, don't get me wrong, but where you'd get the best of Glenn, because he'd be a brilliant number 10, obviously, little balls in and behind defenders, scoring goals. But Glenn's long-range passing, where he could hit a ball 60, 70 yards, and like I say, a much heavier balls. Think of it in the weather, in the rain, when that ball got even heavier as the leather got wetter. And, with backspin on a ball so that Crooksy could just run onto it, no first touch needed, just bang. So you'd kind of think, well, Glenn's got to play just in front of the back four to get the benefit of his all-round game. It's just an amazing player. Most gifted player England have ever produced, for sure. Certainly in my knowledge.
Yeah, they tried him once in I think Bobby Robson was the manager in Hungary, a game in Hungary. They won 3-0. Don't know if you remember the game. He scored a great free kick, Hoddle, in the game, and but they played him behind the strikers. It was so they had 3 in midfield, and then Glenn behind the 2 strikers, and I think that was his best position. But Bobby Robson was under a lot of pressure. A lot of the press was calling for him to be fired at the time, so he just he didn't play him in the end. He just went with more players that like to tackle. But that was his best position, and it was forced on him really in the '86 World Cup, and we ended up, I think if we'd have gone through Argentina, we probably would have won that tournament, to be honest. And Glenn was on fire there. As soon as he moved into the middle, the team looked 100% better attacking wise. But what a great player! And look at the goals he scored as well. Some of the goals. I mean, my favourite one was the one at Watford when he done the little turn, and then he chipped it. I think it was Steve Sherwood in goal. He's about 6'5", and he was standing on the line, and he's chipped him. I even think for younger viewers or younger listeners that weren't around to watch Glenn play, you can still appreciate the quality of that goal. You can. I mean, listen, you don't have to obviously have seen him live up close to watch it, but just a remarkable player, wonderful icon for Tottenham. And like I say, great to see him back at full health now. That's the most important thing. But what we are going to do is we are going to go for our final break of the show. For our listeners on audio, for those that are watching this back, we're joined by the wonderful Jason McGovern, and we're joined by author of Tottenham's Free Lines for Club and Country, John Chambers. That book out right now via Amazon and Legends Publishing. We have got a competition along with this to win a free copy of the book, so make sure you stay tuned for what that question is, which John is going to read out towards the closure of this show. Now, John, another whose cap total was not only so long overdue, but also ridiculously low is Stevie Perryman, our all-time appearance record holder with 854. Yes, 854 appearances. We've had the joy of having him on Last Word on Spurs, which has been great for us. Loved having him on. Jason absolutely loved having him on for that show. A really, really special show for us. Tell us a little bit about Stevie. And another one who's, again, just a remarkable player to have pulled an England shirt on and been captain, a special player of Tottenham. Yeah, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, captains to ever play for Spurs. I was lucky enough to see, missed the early part of his career when he was mainly playing in midfield. But then in fact, the first season I went, he was playing centre-half. That showed how versatile he was. And then he was pretty good at centre-half. And I know I've spoken to him a few times, and he's actually of the opinion that if he was 3 or 4 inches taller, he could have actually played for England at centre-half because he read the game. He's fantastic at reading the game. And but a bit unlucky with England, Steve. I think a victim of the fact that the Spurs team struggled quite a bit through the mid-70s when he probably would have been selected through no fault of his own, really. It's just the fact that a lot of players came to the end of their career and and also some young players that were supposed to actually replace them, like Jimmy Pearce and Roger Morgan and Peter Collins. They all got sort of injuries that finished their careers early as well. And I know Steve always cites that as that was the beginning of the demise of the team, as well as all of the guys like Chivers and Peters all coming to the sort of like the end of their sort of first division careers and being sold off and whatever. And so the players wasn't replaced. And unfortunately, the team suffered for quite a while until the likes of Hoddle and our dealers and everyone come back. But Steve, I think Steve was unlucky. He was record. So Steve played at schoolboy level for England. Back in 1967, just before he signed for Spurs, just as they won the cup, and we were fortunate enough to sign him. I think there was about 35 clubs wanted to sign him, and he was keen on staying in London. He actually, I think he was a QPR fan actually when he was a young lad, and he did have an offer from them as well, and Brentford, who were local to where he lived out in sort of Hillingdon way. But I think Spurs won the race because they paid for his father to come to the 1967 Cup final, and plied him with quite a lot of alcohol, I think, on the day. And and so he signed for Spurs anyway, and then he played some England youth games as well. And then he played for the under-23s and record cap holder at under-23 level as well. So he won 17 caps, equaling Martin Chivers' record. So they both hold the record for that. So fully expected to go on and play for the full England side. But I think what didn't help him was, I think if Alf Ramsey had stayed in charge, because Alf used to pick the under-23 team as well as the England side as well. And Alf picked him a few times at the early part of his under-23 career. And I think if Alf had stayed in charge, I think he would have won some caps in the mid-70s. But unfortunately, Joe Mercer came in for a few games, and then Don Revie come in, and both just didn't fancy him, basically. I think that's all it comes down to, just preference of a manager, which you get quite a lot, don't you, with players. You know, sometimes you can be an England player, the manager changes, and then you never play again, basically, and they bring their own players in. You know, like Graham Taylor with Carlton Palmer.
Oh, yeah. Carlton Palmer, yeah. I was going to say that 67 Cup final for our younger listeners. That's one of the 17 major trophies we've never won.
Yeah, I always say that at the beginning of my introductions on the tour as well. Yeah, we've won 17 major trophies, and there's only 6 teams in the whole history of English football that have won more trophies, and 2 of those teams have only overtaken us in the last 10 years. So we are quite high up on that list. Yeah.
Worth a reminder, isn't it? Worth a reminder. Jace, let's hand back over to you.
Yeah, and then you mentioned it earlier, but Turkey, Izmir, 1987, Tottenham set a record as far as England were concerned then.
Yeah, before I mention that, can I just go back to Stevie? Stevie's one game was in 1982, and he doesn't like the fact that he won a cap. He actually says, I wish I'd never got it, to be honest. He feels like it was like a token cap. He won the Player of the Year that season. Do you remember the Football Writers Player of the Year? And so they picked, England had 2 games in 2 days, one in Finland and one in Iceland. So they had 2 squads. So the game in Iceland was effectively, it was a B game originally, and Steve was selected for that alongside Glenn Hoddle, and the game finished 1-1, and because the game finished 1-1, Iceland asked for it to be upgraded to a full international because it was a good result for them. So it was upgraded to a full international, so that's where your full cap comes from. Glenn was outstanding in the game, set the goal up for Paul Goddard, and that really won his place in the squad for the 82 squad, which was picked a few days later, the last final selections. And does anyone know who scored the goal for Iceland that day? Played a pivotal role.
Jason might tell you.
That is a random question, I know, but he played a very pivotal role in Tottenham's history.
Idegard Johnson's father, who missed in the 84 shootout.
Exactly, yeah.
That's why Jason always wins the shit quiz. That's why Jason always wins the shit quiz.
I learn these things, mate.
I'm learning.
Yeah, he also, so it was Arne Good Johnson who, as Jason said, missed the penalty in the UEFA Cup, the deciding penalty in the UEFA Cup final. And Ida's was his son, who also went on to play for Spurs. And when Ida made his debut for Iceland, he replaced his father on the pitch. Yeah, because that was the substitution. Wow. Yeah, but unfortunately, Ida got injured after that as well, so they never actually got to play together on the same team. But they actually replaced each other in his first match. Yeah, so little fact there. Yeah, so you're going on to Izmir in 1987. That was Spurs had 5 players playing that team, so it broke the record that we were speaking about earlier from 1921 when we had 4 players. So the 5 players were Hoddle, Waddle, Mabbott, Hodge, and Clive Allen. And it was a 0-0 draw. I think it was a European Championship match.
That's Spursy then.
Yeah. I think Turkey had improved. I think in the early 80s we used to beat them 8-0, but I think they were starting to get a bit better by the late 80s. But yeah, not a great night for England, but they managed to qualify in the end anyway. But a great night for Spurs to have 5 players start the game. So that's happened a few times since. As I mentioned earlier, Euro 2016. With Kane, Ali, Dyer, Walker, and Rose.
Yep.
I think they played a few games in that tournament. All 5 of them were on the pitch or started as well. And then also in the 2018. So Walker had moved on to Manchester City, but we'd been replaced by Trippier. So we had five starters in that tournament as well. So yeah, 5's quite a lot. I think there's only been Liverpool had 6 start in 1977. I think Ron Green was first game in charge, that great Liverpool team that used to win all the European Cups. Ray Clements, our own Ray Clements, was part of them 6 Liverpool teams. But unfortunately, the record's held by the other lot down the road, unfortunately. It was 7 back in the 1930s. Wow. But we won't talk about that.
And then we say no more about that, John, and we will move swiftly on. Perhaps our craziest player debuted was in 1988, winning the first 20 of his 57 caps, while at Spurs, of course, Gazza. What's your memories, John, of Gazza? We have to obviously ask you that, and yeah, just kind of ploy into that real question.
Gazza, yeah, great player. Not much between him and Glenn Hoddle, in my opinion. Different type of player, but a more sort of robust player. Run with the ball more, but a great range of passing. What a fantastic player! Could win a game on his own, couldn't he? Virtually won us that 1991 FA Cup. He virtually won us the whole tournament on his own. I know he was injured early on in the final, but you know he got us the 2 goals at Portsmouth. Then he scored the winner against Notts County in the quarter-final, the free kick against the other lot in the semis, and the little interchange of passing he done for Lineker's goal in that game as well. I mean, world class. And he'd only had a stomach operation about 6 weeks before that semi-final as well, and they'd sort of managed to get him fit for it, and so he managed to last an hour. And I think he won us that tournament on his own. But again, it's another thing with England. England, you know, in 1988, they never even took him to the Euros. You know, there was a clamour. The press wanted him to go, but he never went. And then there was even in 1990, there was still talk of, is he going to make the squad? And it was just mad. And you look how well he played in the 1990 World Cup. You know, he ran the show, didn't he? And you know, but the managers, you know, they just don't want to pick the most skillful players in England. I mean, hopefully that's changed a little bit in these days. But back in those days, it was more sort of they wanted the players that run around and tackle, didn't they? But again, Gazza should have won more caps than he did, and it was a bit of a shame that he never went to the 1998 World Cup. You know, I think he was fully expecting to go to that World Cup, and then Glenn sort of dropped him out at the last minute. And he was very upset about that. But yeah, fantastic player for Spurs as well. I mean, I saw quite a lot of his games. Used to go to a lot of the games away then as well. And he was out of this world, to be honest. Yeah, fantastic player.
Fantastic player. And it might come as a surprise for the younger ones, but the majority of Gary Lineker's 80 caps, which was a surprise to me, the majority of those 80 caps came while he was at Tottenham. And, you know, when you think Spurs, Gary Lineker by then was established very firmly as England's #1 striker, goes from Everton to Barcelona, and Tottenham go and sign Barcelona and England's #1 striker. I mean, when will we do that now? That just shows you the level of player we could attract then.
No, that's right. Yeah, he came from Barca, and I think it was us and Manchester United wanted to sign him, and we managed to get hold of him, which, like you say, and that was the same with Gazza as well. Gazza, Alex Ferguson wanted Gazza as well. We managed to nab both of them players from under the nose of Man United. So that shows you a sort of pull we had back in those days. But yeah, he won 38 of his 80 caps while at Spurs, and all his captaincies were at Spurs as well, because it was after the 1990 World Cup. I think Butcher was the captain, wasn't he, in 1990 World Cup? Terry Butcher, or it might have been Shilton. Yeah, I think it
might have been Shilts or something.
It might have been Shilton or Butcher. One of them was captain anyway. And then once, I think that they both retired after that World Cup, so Lineker got the armband. And another great player. I mean, he was devastatingly fast, over 20 yards. That was his real sort of, if anything came across that box, he was there. I mean, sometimes I watch goals. Even the game at the weekend, there was, I can't remember who it was now, but someone put a lovely cross across the 6-yard box, and there was no one there to tap it in. And I thought, well, Lineker would have just slid in and got that. That was his fault. I think he only ever scored one goal for Spurs from outside the box. They was all sort of like from the penalty spot inwards mainly. They're all sort of. Paul Allen once told me that. I used to think he was fast over 10 yards, but Paul Allen said to me, no, it was 20 yards. He was the fastest player he's ever seen over 20 yards, and that's where he got all his goals. And to be able to run at that speed, and also to have the composure of, if you watch a lot of his goals where he just little dinks it over the goalkeeper, and it's always sort of like the perfect finish. And to do it at that speed is a real talent. A lot of people just say, oh, he just tapped the ball in. But no, he's a quality player, Gary Lineker as well, yeah. And just a shame that only young people think he's famous for selling crisps and being on Match of the Day.
Introing, if we can, John, into the 90s, 1993, Teddy Sheringham's England debut, the start of his 51 caps that spread over 2 periods as a Spurs player. I think it's particularly worth mentioning, of course, that famous Greek World Cup quarter-final game, and also, of course, mentioning Teddy's last cap as well. And the fact that year also saw, I think, Ziga become the first contracted Spur to appear in a World Cup final. Just give us your flavour of that period, if you can, John.
Yeah, again, Sheringham was sort of brought in to replace Lineker, really, wasn't he? Different type of striker, a more sort of... more of a centre forward, I thought, at Millwall and whatever. But when he sort of come to Spurs, he sort of, especially when we signed Jurgen Klinsmann, he sort of took the back role, the more sort of number 10 role, where he drop off and let Klinsmann do the more sort of centre forward stuff. But he was capable of doing both. Quality centre forward and a quality link player as well. Very skillful player, fantastic brain on him. Could see a pass. And it's no surprise that Alan Shearer, Jurgen Klinsmann, all these people, they all say that he's the best player that they ever played with, to be honest. Yeah, he was fantastic for Spurs. Brilliant in Euro 96. Like I mentioned earlier, I went to all those games at Wembley. Should have won that tournament. If Anderton's one hadn't come back off the post, and the one that went across the goal when Gaza slid in, that was in golden goal extra time. Any of those go in, we probably would have beat Czech Republic in the final. And I think we were the best team in that tournament. The goal against Greece, I think he'd come back to Spurs by then. I think he came off the bench and scored. And I think that still stands as England's fastest goal by substitute. Scored like within 20 seconds or something. Fastest goal by substitute, that is. And then he got the free kick as well, the famous, that David Beckham. I think he wanted to take it as well, but Beckham luckily pushed him out of the way, and put it in. And like you say, went to that World Cup. Little bit of a bit part player in that World Cup because he was getting on by then, but still played his role. Ziga was the first contracted Spurs player to play in a World Cup final that tournament. They lost 2-0, didn't they, to Brazil? Who's the only other contracted Spurs player to play in a World Cup final is Hugo, I think.
Wow.
Yeah. Got any? I'll give you a little quiz here, guys. Can you name some Spurs players that have played in a World Cup final, but when they played in the World Cup final, they wasn't contracted to Spurs? There's only two that are. There's only Lloris and Ziga that are the contracted ones.
How far have I got to go back here, John? Is it in my lifetime, this one?
No, we're going back to 66.
Oh, that's a free course for Jason here.
Yeah.
So that's a 66 team. Who came through? Martin Peters obviously scored.
That's it, yeah. Martin Peters, he played for Spurs. So these are non-contracted players that have played in a World Cup final. So Peters is one.
And is there one more, John? One more, you say, or more than one more?
Well, there's more than one. Yeah. Big player. 78 World Cup. Come on.
Oh, cool. Aussie and Ricky.
Aussie, yeah. Yeah, there's a few others. I think Van der Vaart played in a World Cup final. Perisic, Modric, yeah.
Right.
But yeah.
Of course,
yeah. Fascinating stuff. It really, really is. Jace, we'll come over to you for the next part.
Yep, and then of course, as we get more into modern times, we had two big England centre halves. One who we never mentioned particularly too much. The other one we definitely mention as a fine ambassador and what a brilliant legend he is for the club.
Yeah, what can you say about Ledley King? 363 games for Spurs. Probably would have had maybe 100 more appearances, maybe even more, but for his injuries. Had a
He's
knee.
only got one knee, apparently, hasn't he?
Yeah, he doesn't like that, actually. He doesn't like that
No,
song.
he doesn't. No.
He doesn't like it, no. But but what a guy. I mean, he's a fantastic bloke as well. He does a lot of the stuff he does Legends tours with us at the stadium as well. And everyone loves him. He's a fantastic ambassador for the club. But the last few years he played, he had no cartilage in his knee at all. So it was literally like the bone just rubbing on the bone. So, I mean, Harry Redknapp used to call him Superman because he basically used to play a game and then he wouldn't be able to train the whole week and then just maybe do a little bit of training the day before and then play on the Saturday again and still be the best player on the pitch.
He kind of defies science, doesn't he, John, really? I mean, it just defies anything of modern, technology or any kind of modern day planning from a manager like a Conte or like a Pep or like a Klopp, that you've got a guy that cannot train a week, but then go out there on a Saturday or a Sunday and be 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10.
That's it. A bit like Paul McGrath. You'll remember him, Jace. Yeah. He was the same as well, wasn't he? Paul McGrath. He was the same sort of thing. But he, again, should have played more games for England. I think he played 21 games, I think. But he should have won more. It was just the fact that when Ericsson was the manager, he only liked to pick players that played in the Champions League. That was one of the reasons why the unmentionable person that you said earlier, he actually asked him to leave Spurs and go and play for a team in the Champions League. But he should have gone somewhere. He went to the wrong one, though. But never mind. Yeah. I mean, he played.
Brilliant defender, though. He was a brilliant defender.
Yeah, and he had John Terry and Rio Ferdinand all at the same time as well. So it was strong competition. But I actually think if you'd have put Ledley alongside any of them, it would have been a better combination because he was absolutely fantastic. Do you remember the game he played at Euro 2004 when Terry was suspended for the first game and King played against France and he was marking Henry and he just completely marked him out of the game.
Didn't Henry say afterwards, though, I think in a latter interview, I think may have been playing for Spurs, that he rated Ledley King the most, respected him the most, because he was the only defender he had that never really kicked him. Was that right? I'm sure he says that on those lines.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he said that. He said he's the only ever defender that could play against him without resorting to fouling. Yeah, that shows. And he was never booked for England. I mean, in this day and age, over the last sort of 20 years, where you get a card for doing anything, don't you? So that's a remarkable achievement as well. But he never really went to ground much, did he? He didn't need to. He was so fast over the ground. He was so fast and ahead of the game. He knew where the ball was going to be. There was that one time when he did go to ground, but he was about 15 yards behind Iron Robin, wasn't he? Do you remember that tackle? That was one of the best tackles ever, and he always jokes about it because he got back, done the tackle, brilliant tackle. They got a corner. The corner came in. He headed it away. He headed it away, but Makelele kicked it in from 25 yards. So after all that, they still scored. But
I love that Makelele didn't score many, did he? Makelele didn't score many in his career.
He actually made a really similar one against Darren Huckabee in a Tottenham Norwich game, and people can remember Darren Huckabee was lightning quick.
Oh, wonderful goal scorer, brilliant goal scorer.
Maybe not the most skillful, but Jesus, was he quick, Darren Huckabee, a bit like Craig Bellamy type pace. And I remember that game. It might have even been a 0-0 draw or something like that with Norwich, and for some reason they wore red. I'm pretty certain Norwich wore red that day, but he made an amazing challenge, Robin-esque, on Darren Huckabee, and I mean, he barely made a foul, did he? I mean, it wasn't just the fact he wasn't carded; he just barely made a foul. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
No, he's remarkable. Well, here we are. I mean, John, for us recording here, we're recording during the World Cup, where England, of course, will be relying on one of our own, Harry Kane, to become England's greatest goal scorer. Like I say, I mean, from your end, I think he's now the most capped Spurs player. And I mean, again, it'll be intriguing to know from your perspective whether you still believe he will go on to become one of the best in England's shirt based on the goals he'll score. John, what do you think over the course of the next few tournaments?
to be honest, I think he already is. As far as goal scoring is concerned, I mean, he's our most capped player now for England. He's got 75 caps. So he took that from Jermaine Defoe, was actually our most capped player at one stage, and he took it from Glenn Hoddle, who took it from Jimmy Greaves, who took it from Alf Ramsey, who took it from Vivian Woodward. So there you go. It goes all the way back. So yeah, but 75 caps, 51 goals. He's only 2 goals behind Wayne Rooney now already. And like I mentioned earlier, Wayne Rooney's played about 45 games more.
And I must just caveat that, John, and just say, when you're listening to this now, he may have already gone past that record. We must just he may have already gone past it. If he has done, congratulations to Harry. If he isn't, he is on course, John, to do so. And
he probably will do. But I mean, some of the records he already holds for England are just unbelievable. He's the highest goal-scoring captain of all time. He's scored 43 goals in 50 matches as captain. He actually took that record from Vivian Woodward. That record had stood all the way from way back in the early 1900s. So that was a record. He scored the most goals in major tournaments. He's equal with Gary Lineker. So any goals he gets in the World Cup, he will instantly go above that. He scored the most goals in the European Championship. That's including qualifying and the finals. So he scored 19 goals. He's actually equal with Wayne Rooney, so I'm sure he'll beat that at some stage as well. And he scored the most goals in World Cup finals and qualifying combined as well. He's got 23. And he scored the most penalties for England, 16 penalties. That's Lampard previously held the record with 9. He's also missed the most penalties for England. That might surprise you. Yeah, he's missed 3. Yeah, so it shows.
As things stand, I must have said, John, he might have missed a few more in his cut. Hopefully, he hasn't done, but we must say that.
Yeah, and
what's the 3 penalties? I can remember him missing one down at Southampton for England.
Oh, you got me there. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. He missed one. I'm sure he missed one against Australia. Yeah, right. I think they've only been in friendly matches. I don't think they've been in really important games. Yeah,
well, because of course he missed, didn't he, against Denmark, but scored the rebound.
Yeah, that is one of them. Yeah, obviously that's one of them.
Must be one of
that goes down as a missed penalty. Yeah. But he still scored the rebound. He
just played a 1-2 off of Schmeichel. That's how good he is.
I know he's got 5 hat tricks for England. That's one less than Jimmy Greaves, who holds the record. So I'm sure he'll beat that at some stage. And he's goal scoring. He's scored the most goals in a calendar year as well, 16, and that obliterates the previous record, which was 13 as well. So as you say, I mean, by the time he finishes his career, he should have every England goal scoring record, to be honest.
I do think it will probably take for Kane when he retires to get the full respect he probably deserves from the other teams around. I mean, at the moment, because of the tribalism around football, I think Kane is viewed as, again, for some reason, put in almost a category of, a non-winner, hasn't won a trophy. But I do think when his career ends, he will be appreciated, I think, in and around the country, like Spurs fans have appreciated him for the time he's given to the club. Here is the bingo caller, conscious of time. Jason Coburn, back to you.
Yeah, just in recent times, we've seen Kane, Townsend, Mason, Anthony Costa's favourite, Harry Winks, of course, has also gone on. How many of those caps have come through what you would call the academy system for England? That have done it whilst, because obviously Carl Walker-Peters will have been the last one, but in their time at Tottenham have gone through academy
I think
to debut.
In the time at Tottenham, I think around 22. To be honest, if you go back and you include all the players, a bit like Jimmy Dimmock, there was no academy back then, but they joined Spurs straight from school, whatever. Yeah, so about 22. Yeah, 22 in total. So we had quite a glut of them, didn't we, a little while ago? Well, with like you say, Corker, Livermore, Mason, Kane, Townsend as well. Yeah. But you can't really count Walker and Rose, even though they sort of played for our youth teams. We did actually buy them from other clubs. But quite a lot. Yeah, it's a good tradition of Spurs players coming through and playing for England. Yeah.
Well, I've got to say, John, this has been a real footballing lesson for me, which I know Jason has taken great pride on me, just looking at me in complete amazement at times as the stats you read out. But I've got to say, along with this, again, it kind of just reinforces the fact Spurs are breaking all these records. And I know we're during a World Cup break recording this, it even more so pushes the fact that we do need to win. some bloody trophies at this club. It's some wonderful records there that have been eclipsed by Spurs players representing their country. And I've got to say, been a real pleasure having you on, John. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as me and Jason have enjoyed it. It's been great for us.
Thank you.
This book, of course, is available, as we've said, via, obviously, Amazon, via Legends Publishing. And there you go. John is holding it up for our watching audience on YouTube there. Tottenham's Three Lions.
Yes.
I mean,
Cracker.
Jace, you had a copy of the book beforehand. So you had a chance to prepare before we brought John on. Anything you want to say on the book itself and how much you enjoyed it?
Like I say, especially with Christmas time coming up, it's a brilliant production. First of all, some fantastic pictures in there. It's quality of the book produced superb, and it's you can see it's a nice big chunky read. So look at that one. That's a great one of Jermaine. So definitely a book that should be on every. And there's even look at that. There's even a trophy that we haven't won. There's another one of those trophies.
One of those magical trophies.
It's amazing. One of those 17 we've never won. So no, it's like I say, it should be on everyone's coffee table and a good read. And Rick, you'll learn so much about our history.
I know. Well, honestly, when I come on and do these shows like this, and I do them with Jason, I feel so unqualified. I shouldn't.
You'll even learn about how they tied ribbons on the FA Cup and things like that.
It's brilliant, mate. Yeah, I did try to. Within the profiles of all the players, I tried to encompass as much history of Spurs as possible.
Yeah.
So it's not just the profile about the player. Sometimes go off into tangents and start talking about, like Jason said, about the ribbons on the FA Cup, or the fact that the 21 FA Cup final was the first time they wore the cockerel on the shirt. But it rained so much in the first half that they had to change the shirts at half time. So by the time they picked the cup up at the end, there was no cockerel on the shirt. It's a disappearing cockerel. So there's all stories like that within the book about all the players, and tried to get as much information that I've read a lot of Spurs books, and there's a lot of info in there that are in the Spurs books that I've read, but there's also a lot of info in there that I think people won't have read as well, which I'm hoping that so if you wasn't a Spurs fan or an England fan, I think you can read that book and you would know the whole history of Spurs and England by reading that book. I tried to, each player's got a profile on their club career and then their England career as well, so it's that in depth. So just before we go, guys, I would like to say thank you to the publisher, David Lane at Legends Publishing. Like Jason said, he's done a fantastic job in putting the book together. It's a high quality book, glossy pages, colourful photographs, which the publishers have paid for on every single page as well, virtually, and 420 pages, and hardback coffee table book. They've done a brilliant job. So thank you, David, for that. And thanks for your time, guys, as well. Thanks for having me on as well. It's been a pleasure. It's been great.
We absolutely loved it. Before we do let you go, John, we are going to give the viewers who have hopefully been paying attention for this last hour and a half a chance to get a free copy of the book. Now, John has the question which he's going to read out, and the answer which was disclosed earlier to win a copy of the book. So if you've just been sitting there kind of, glancing back on your commute to work, you haven't really been paying attention, you do have to go back and listen to the last hour and a half to get the answer. So that gives you an excuse again to go and watch it back or listen back to it. John, would you like to give us the question of where people can obviously win this competition? I must just say this will apply to, just so we're clear, it will apply to our UK audience, this one, for the competition. So John, if you don't mind reading out the question you'd like to put to the viewers.
Yeah, okay. So question is, Bill Nicholson played for England one match and he scored on his debut. Can you tell me what the time was of the goal? How many minutes or seconds he scored in?
There you go. You heard that from John there, that question. So if you want to send in your replies to lastwordonspurs@outlook.com, if you email us to that email again, lastwordonspurs@outlook.com, to John's question that he's read out there with the answer, you will be in with a chance of winning a copy of that book right now, Tottenham's Three Lions for Club and Country. Jace, thank you so much. Been a real pleasure. This one of a number we've got coming out over the World Cup break.
Yeah, I love the history of Tottenham and looking back on it. So, and I think I've done a stadium tour with John and also with Vince, who's another host who will be known to Spurs fans. So always good to talk about the history of Tottenham, mate.
And I'm sure you're
always good to give you a lesson.
Yeah, I was going to give me a lesson. I've had a lesson. Tell me, I really have. John, been a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure, John, people can come and say hello to you when they're on the tour. They'll hopefully see you from doing this. Fingers crossed.
You can do, yeah. I'm in there most days, working there, so they can come along, say hi.
Amazing. John, thank you so much. Been a pleasure having you on Last Word on Spurs. We wish you all the very best with the book. A reminder, of course, that book can be bought at Legends Publishing and via Amazon. From Jason, from John and myself, guys, we hope you're enjoying the breakaway from Tottenham and the rest of the World Cup. As always, please keep safe, keep well, and come on, you